In 19 years of forensic work, I've only had one case that chilled me so much I still hesitate to talk about it. The man on my table was supposed to be a suicide, but his body told a different story. His ligature marks were too perfect, his shoes polished, his stomach full of Chinese takeout. And then the tapping started. Rhythmic, patterned, as if someone unseen was trying to speak. This wasn't just a medical puzzle, it was a case that blurred the line between science, crime, and something I still can't explain. Why would a man button a freshly pressed shirt and polish his shoes before ending his own life? That was the thought that struck me the moment I unzipped the body bag and saw Adrian Holt lying there. After conducting thousands of autopsies, I knew the usual picture of suicide by hanging. The reality is rarely orderly. Most arrive in jeans, sometimes work clothes, sometimes pajamas. Often the nails carry dirt or skin from clawing at the rope in panic. These details create a landscape of desperation. Holt, though, was groomed, presented almost as if he had been prepared for a business meeting rather than death. That contradiction forced me to pay closer attention, and very quickly I realized the entire body undermined the story laid out in the police report. The first thing I noticed was his fingernails. They were spotless, trimmed, and without the slightest sign of dirt or debris. My usual expectation is fractured edges, sometimes even bleeding cuticles from the struggle to breathe. I ran the surface against the light, smooth, shining, almost manicured. His shirt was crisp, unwrinkled, free from sweat. It clung to his shoulders as though it had been put on only minutes earlier. Even the soles of his shoes polished back the fluorescent reflection of my lab lights. Taken as isolated facts, these could have been dismissed as unique habits of a neat man, but placed against the context of a supposed suicide, they carried a very different weight. It was like examining an image that has been touched up a little too perfectly. I turned my focus to the ligature marks. In hangings, the skin usually reveals small, irregular grooves, slight shifts in rope placement, traces of movement, the uneven tightening as the body settles. Holt's neck showed nothing like that. The impression was uniform from side to side, clean, almost mechanically consistent, without the faint abrasions I would normally expect when someone struggles. It didn't read like the record of desperation. It read like someone had applied pressure with precision, controlled, unhurried. I had seen strangulation before, both crude and calculated, but what set this apart was its sterile neatness. For all its supposed finality, it looked staged. Then came the stomach contents. A detailed analysis showed he had eaten less than 2 hours before his death. Noodles, vegetables, a heavy sauce, food that still smelled faintly of ginger when I teased the tissues apart. Clinically, it was unremarkable, but behaviorally, it jarred. People making their final decision rarely sit down to a full meal. I'd seen patients who left meals untouched or who took only small bites, restless and agitated. This was different. His belly was full, almost comfortably so, as if he hadn't anticipated that evening to end in such a way at all. That struck me harder than the shirt and shoes. Food tells a story. Hunger, satisfaction, or ritual. It always says something about state of mind. Holt's meal suggested anticipation of tomorrow, not an end. The contradictions lined up like dominoes, clinical neatness where there should have been chaos, a meal chosen as if he planned to keep living, ligature marks that whispered calculation instead of desperation. I found myself staring down at him, not as a victim of his own hand, but as a carefully assembled scene where someone wanted us to assume closure without asking questions. I had followed death long enough to recognize when the narrative was wrong. This one was wrong everywhere I looked. The police report waiting on my desk described a straightforward suicide. My table revealed something else entirely. The body was telling me a different story, one that no paperwork could conceal. I realized then that what lay in front of me demanded attention far beyond a cause of death checkmark. If even the body could be arranged to deceive, the room itself might hold distortions just as deep. And as I prepared to continue my work, I started to wonder, If the truth wasn't on the surface of Adrian Holt's skin, what else around me could no longer be trusted? What happens when the silence of a clinical lab is broken by a sound that shouldn't exist? I had been in that room countless times. So many that I could tell you the way the fluorescent lights hummed just before they warmed fully, the faint rattle of the refrigeration system, even the muffled clicks of the ventilation fans along the back wall. It was a rhythm of machinery that didn't change, no matter who lay waiting on my table. That consistency was what made the space comfortable for me. It gave a sense of control, a structure where everything could be explained by a piece of evidence or a mechanism. That night, though, it became clear that the room wasn't following its own rules. I was taking notes beside Holt's body when I heard it. At first, I thought it was a tick from the cooling unit or maybe my pen tapping the clipboard, but then it repeated with the same crisp interval between each sound. Tap, pause, tap, pause. I froze, listening, trying to place it. It wasn't the irregular slap of a pipe or the grind of old wiring. It was steady, like it had been measured out against a metronome. I put the pen down, to be sure, and the sound came again, clearer without the scratch of ink as cover. 3 taps this time, evenly spaced. I scanned the room. Nothing had shifted. The digital monitor glowed its usual muted green. There was no movement near the doors, no carts rattling, no technician walking past. Yet the noise pressed against my ears like it was coming from just beyond the table. My training told me to look for sources, to trace it logically like any anomaly in the lab. But something about the way it repeated, then paused, then returned, had an edge to it that didn't fit mechanical error. I knew machines could fail. I also knew machines don't keep rhythm with intention. The air itself changed. It was a temperature drop, almost half a degree, enough that the small hairs on the back of my arm lifted without me looking at the thermostat. Usually the suite was cool but even, designed so I could stand for long hours without discomfort. On this night, the cold pressed against the metal tray and against my skin like the room itself was thickening. The silence between taps grew heavier, filled with a stillness so dense it made me hold my breath. Every sense sharpened. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights felt louder, fighting perversely against the unnatural beat that cut through. Then came a new pattern. A double tap, followed by a single one. And when I shifted closer to examine Holt's chest, the sequence repeated as if it was answering my movement. I stepped back, and it stopped. I stood still long enough that the quiet felt unbearable, and then again, tap, tap, pause, tap. I couldn't ignore the possibility that something was responding to me. Scientific instincts demand cause, a chain you can follow from observation to explanation. But here I had an event without a source, a sound that behaved like an interaction but left no trace I could record. I remember glancing up, hoping to steady myself on routine, and that was when one of the fluorescent tubes flickered. A rapid pulse, then a dimming glow, before it steadied again. The lights in that room aren't supposed to flicker. They're monitored, replaced in cycles before a bulb burns down. I could excuse one tube failing by chance, but while I watched, 2 more flickered, briefly out of sync, as if echoing the taps across another medium. Then silence again, deep enough that my own heart sounded out of place. And just inside that silence, faint but unmistakable, came a whisper. Not a voice I could distinguish, but a vibration low and human enough to feel wrong in the clinical air. I'm not someone who turns to folklore or superstition. My work grounds me in tissue cause and effect. But standing there that night, I had to admit I was in the presence of something I couldn't catalog. Every fiber of my professional identity pulled me toward evidence, yet all the evidence said nothing should be happening, and still it was. The intrusion was real, and with it a thought I couldn't dismiss. Either someone else was watching from where I couldn't see, or something was trying very hard for me to listen. The environment unsettled me, but it was the trace beneath Adrian Holt's fingernail that truly broke what remained of my routine. A microscopic discovery that didn't belong to Holt himself was waiting under his fingernail. That's the kind of detail you don't expect to find, especially when the fingers look as immaculate as his did. Part of the standard procedure in any autopsy is to take scrapings even when nothing obvious is visible. It isn't glamorous and often turns up nothing more than trace dirt or fibers, but it's part of being thorough. That night, the step felt almost mechanical, going through motions I had done thousands of times before. I took the tool, eased it beneath the nail, and collected the sample without resistance. Already a thought pressed the back of my mind. Nails that clean should have yielded emptiness. They didn't. When the fragment appeared beneath the microscope, I understood something was very wrong. It wasn't a fiber, it wasn't dust. It was human tissue, a minute fragment of skin. My first thought was that maybe Holt had unconsciously scratched himself at some point before death. That would have explained it easily enough, but his fingers were uninjured, clear of abrasions or redness. His body carried no marks consistent with self-scratching. The skin beneath his nails should have matched his own. Still, I checked. Under magnification, the structure did not align with the cells I later cross-referenced from Holt's samples. Nuclei size, membrane formation, even trace pigmentation markers, they were off, not by a margin you could dismiss as laboratory error, but by a margin that screamed of another individual entirely. The magnitude of this discovery hit me harder because the lab itself leaves no room for accidental contamination. Every surface is sterilized, every tool carefully cleaned, every step documented with times and initials. If anything finds its way inside a sealed specimen bag, it got there before it reached my hands. That skin fragment hadn't materialized in my lab. It had been deposited beneath Holt's nail while he was still alive or very close to it. Suddenly, I wasn't just looking at evidence of another person's presence. I was holding what amounted to a biological fingerprint of the last individual he encountered. Once the lab completed DNA sequencing, the anomaly gained a name: Gabriel Rohr. The files described him as a former military contractor with time spent overseas, someone who had carried out operations in volatile regions before quietly resurfacing stateside. The records that crossed my desk noted repeated allegations of violence, never formally charged but never far from suspicion. To find his genetic trace embedded beneath Holt's perfect nail was like pulling a thread that led directly to a shadow figure. If I had been searching an entire field for a single pin, this felt like having the pin dropped neatly in front of me with its point aimed upward. In that moment, the case of Adrian Holt could no longer rest in the tidy box of suicide. No theory of self-harm accounted for pristine nails concealing another man's skin cells. This wasn't an act of isolation or despair, but a scene as carefully constructed as the ligature marks that encircled his throat. I remember staring at the lab report, reading Rohr's name again and again, realizing how different the scope of the case had suddenly become. It wasn't corruption of evidence, it wasn't oversight, it was a deliberate act of staging by someone trained to leave behind only what they chose. Everything about Holt's quiet presentation, the shirt, the polished shoes, the cleanly executed ligature, clicked into a new framework the second the DNA result came back. The precision no longer looked strange, it looked professional. The detail wasn't the mistake of a victim. It was the signature of someone skilled enough to erase traces, but careless enough to overlook a fragment too microscopic for the naked eye. That single error shattered the illusion entirely. The suicide story collapsed under the weight of verifiable evidence. The case transformed into something larger than one carefully arranged death. I was looking at the exposed corner of an operation designed to eliminate people under the mask of self-inflicted endings. If a contractor like Rohr had staged Holt's final appearance, it begged an even more disturbing question. Had others disappeared under the same mask, hidden behind the same tidy curtain of suicide? That was the thought I carried with me as I sealed the samples and signed off my report, the sound of those taps still faint in my ears. What if Adrian Holt had not been the only one? That was the question that arose once my report crossed the desk of Detective Vincent Dorsey. He had been a steady presence in the department for years, known more for persistence than theatrics, and when he read my findings, he made a decision that changed the trajectory of the case. He reopened it. For me, that moment felt like a validation that the contradictions I had found were not just curiosities, but evidence demanding further scrutiny. I continued my work in the lab, but now the investigation widened beyond what Holt's body alone could tell us. The files came together slowly, one at a time, until the pattern started to take shape. 3 other men, all in their early to mid-30s, had died under nearly identical circumstances in the span of just 6 months. Their deaths, filed quickly as suicides, had not raised alarms at the time. Each came through the system dressed too neatly for the situation, found in environments made to look disorderly but lacking the organic traces of struggle. Like Holt, their ligature marks showed a consistency that read more like controlled compression than the uneven realities of hanging. Even their fingernails were alike, short, clean, free of any dirt or the splintering edge that comes from clawing in final desperation. I remember reviewing the photographs carefully, examining enlarged images of the marks left on their skin. In each case, the line across the throat ran uniform, smooth and unbroken, almost like it had been printed from a template. The clothing struck me just as strongly. One man had been found in a tailored suit, another in neatly pressed trousers and a collared shirt. A third wore shoes polished to the same sheen I had noticed on Holt. These details might have seemed like coincidences taken in isolation, but side by side they built an image that was too rehearsed to be explained away. The official reports had all closed the same way: suicide. The paperwork moved quickly through the system as if to close the book with minimal resistance. But then financial forensics painted a different backdrop. Each of these men had ties to a large-scale fraud operation involving millions of dollars. The connections weren't visible on the surface, buried under layers of obscure accounting, but once threads were pulled, they pointed back to shared dealings in the same fraudulent scheme. These men weren't random. They were bound by money and by knowledge that could have sent other people to trial. The suspicion grew heavier when Rohr's name surfaced again. The DNA beneath Holt's fingernail anchored him to one victim, but now informant reports suggested he had been seen in proximity to the others, never formally tied, but always close enough to raise questions. His training as a contractor explained the consistency, the efficiency of a man skilled in precise execution, someone who understood how to stage a scene so the story presented itself to the overworked eyes of investigators. With his background, controlling the narrative wasn't guesswork, it was procedure. The chilling part was how effective it had been. By making these deaths imitate suicide perfectly, the men were marked as guilty before ever speaking in court. Their silence served the purpose of those who hired him. The appearance was tidy, individuals crushed by their own shame. The reality was darker, calculated killings that avoided trials, testimony, or the risk of exposure. Murder rewritten into suicide reports, filed, stamped, and forgotten without dispute. I could see the symmetry laid bare in my notes: the polished shoes, the smooth nails, the uniform marks, the quiet rooms where lives ended. Dorsey saw it too when he stacked the files in his office. What had seemed like isolated tragedies, personal decisions, now revealed themselves instead as deliberate acts in a concealed operation. Holt wasn't the first, and the others had followed almost like clockwork, one by one, each death staged to clear another obstacle from the path of whoever profited from keeping them silent. By the time we recognized this, the illusion of randomness had dissolved. These deaths weren't scattered events, they were linked, and together they formed a single chain, orchestrated carefully, executed with strict consistency. It was no longer a question of whether there was a pattern, but who had designed it. Behind Roar's brutal precision, I started to sense the presence of someone else, an unseen figure steering events with even greater control. And every piece of evidence suggested that this person stayed beyond reach, hidden far deeper than any crime scene could reveal. If Roar was the executioner, who had placed the rope in his hands? That question lingered in every conversation I had with Detective Dorsey. The evidence tied Roar to multiple men whose deaths had been staged, but the bigger picture, the person directing him, remained invisible. Financial investigators began to follow the money, hoping the simplest truth might come through numbers. What they found was a maze. Transactions led to accounts in jurisdictions built to shield owners from scrutiny. Shell companies held shares in other shell companies. Offshore structures dissolved into thin air the moment someone tried to follow them. Each time a path seemed promising, it ended in a blind turn, a name scrubbed clean, or an entity dissolved weeks before anyone arrived to question it. The deeper the team dug, the more it became clear that this wasn't improvised. It was planned. Offshore banking has rules that allow for protection of privacy. Combined with layered business registrations, it creates a system where paper exists, but the person at the top can disappear. That's what we found again and again, trails leading nowhere but too polished to be coincidence. It looked less like scattered corruption and more like a structure built deliberately for one purpose, to separate the real mastermind from the crimes themselves. What unnerved me the most was how consistent that invisibility felt. Roar had been the figure in the spotlight, but if you pulled him away, the machine around him stayed untouched. You could sense in the paperwork alone how someone powerful enough had arranged every step to erase themselves before anyone came close. People like me lived by the chain of evidence, a link from discovery to explanation. But here, every link was routed into deliberate dead ends. It taught me that paper trails could behave almost like camouflage, designed for investigators to follow until fatigue convinced them to stop. We never had the chance to push further. Roar was discovered dead from an apparent overdose not long after his name was confirmed. The irony wasn't lost on me. A man trained to be precise, efficient, and methodical suddenly erased himself in one night. His death brought the official case to a standstill. He became both the villain and the closure. Reports marked justice as served, even though anyone who looked closer understood the truth. The one person directly tied to the staged deaths was gone, and with him the possibility of naming whoever had given the orders. There's a certain unease that comes when justice is written in files but not lived in reality. Outwardly, the murders had been solved. Inwardly, we knew a cover had stitched itself so tightly that nothing more would surface. It was the kind of victory kept for headlines, but not for truth. What haunted me was the recognition that money had made this possible. Financial systems built to protect assets had been used here to protect actions. In organized financial crime, structures are often layered so many levels deep that proving any single individual's guilt becomes almost impossible. What remains visible are fragments, an anonymous company here, a dissolved fund there, never enough to connect to the person pulling the strings. For me, that realization was heavier than anything I had seen on a body. A knife leaves a wound, a rope leaves ligature, but power leaves nothing more than silence. Adrian Holt and the men like him had been killed twice, once in their bodies and once in their stories. It struck me that for them, justice wasn't about naming the weapon. It was about naming the hand that chose to use it. That hand remained hidden. Standing in my lab after the case closed, I thought about how the dead rely on us to speak. Evidence is their only language. But when evidence itself is buried under layers of legality and wealth, the silence becomes heavier, almost unbreakable. These were not deaths obscured by science, anomalies solved by pathology. They were deaths deliberately buried by power, swallowed in systems we could not undo. The truth of the conspiracy surfaced only in outline, enough to glimpse its scale, never enough to dismantle it. And while the investigation stalled, what stayed with me was something more personal. the shift it forced in how I approached every body placed on my table. Because once you learn the dead can be silenced not only by death itself, but by the influence of the living, you can't return to routine as if nothing has changed. The case reminded me that the truth rarely announces itself in dramatic ways. It hides in the quiet places, in the uniform line of a ligature mark, in a spotless fingernail, in a detail so small it almost disappears. Those contradictions, the ones that whisper instead of shout, carry the weight of everything we miss when we only look at the surface. It made me wonder how many lives, how many stories are accepted at face value without question. Sometimes the dead insist on being heard, and the task falls to us to keep listening until their silence breaks.